March 10th, 1876, Boston, Massachusetts. Alexander Graham Bell was working in a small laboratory. In another room, his assistant, Thomas Watson, was waiting beside a strange machine. Then, something extraordinary happened. Watson heard Bell's voice coming through the device. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." The words were simple, but the moment was historic. Bell had successfully sent a clear human voice through an electrical wire. Today, Alexander Graham Bell is often called the inventor of the telephone. But the real story is more complicated. Bell was not the only inventor trying to solve this problem. Other men were experimenting with similar ideas. One had been working on voice communication for years. Another would enter the race at almost exactly the same time as Bell. So how did Alexander Graham Bell become the name most closely connected with the telephone? And who really invented the machine that changed human communication forever? Welcome to TalePath English. Today, we're going back to the 19th century to discover the fascinating story of the invention of the telephone. To understand Bell's story, we need to go back to his childhood. Alexander Graham Bell was born in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1847. Sound and speech were important in his family. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was an expert in speech and pronunciation. His mother, Elisha, was deaf. Young Alexander became deeply interested in how people produced and heard sound. He experimented with music, speech, and simple machines. As he grew older, this interest became more serious. Bell wanted to understand the human voice, but he could not yet imagine that this curiosity would lead him toward an invention that would change the world. By the 19th century, people could already send messages over long distances using the telegraph. Electrical signals traveled through wires. But a telegraph did not carry the human voice. Messages had to be sent as codes. Inventors began asking an exciting question. Could electrical wires carry sound itself? Bell became fascinated by this problem. After moving to North America, he continued studying speech and working with deaf students. At the same time, he experimented with electricity and sound. His original goal was connected to improving the telegraph, but gradually, another possibility appeared. Perhaps a wire could carry not only signals, but the sound of a person's voice. But Bell was not the first person to dream of transmitting speech. Years earlier, an Italian inventor named Antonio Meucci had experimented with devices that could carry sound electrically. Meucci later moved to the United States. He demonstrated versions of his system and filed a patent caveat in 1871. A caveat was a type of notice showing that an inventor was working on an idea. But Meucci faced financial difficulties. He did not obtain the famous telephone patent that Bell would later receive. And Meucci was not the only competitor. An American inventor named Elisha Gray was also developing technology for transmitting sound. Several inventors were moving toward the same idea. The race was becoming very close. Then came one of the most famous moments in the story. On February 14th, 1876, Bell's patent application reached the United States Patent Office. That same day, Elisha Gray submitted a caveat describing work related to transmitting speech electrically. The timing was remarkable. Both men were working on technologies that could help make the telephone possible.
Questions and legal arguments would continue for years. But on March 7th, 1876, Bell received U.S. patent number 174465. Only 3 days later, Bell and Watson carried out the experiment that became famous. Watson heard Bell's voice through the device. The telephone had taken an enormous step forward. Bell's early telephone was very different from the phones we know today. There were no screens, there were no buttons, and there were certainly no apps. The device worked by turning the vibrations of the human voice into electrical signals. Those signals traveled through a wire. At the other end, they were changed back into sound. For the first time, people could imagine speaking to someone who was far away and hearing that person's voice almost immediately. It seemed almost impossible. But Bell knew that people needed to see the invention working, so he began demonstrating it publicly. And soon, the telephone started attracting attention. At first, many people did not understand why they needed a telephone. The telegraph already worked. Why would anyone need to hear another person's voice through a wire? But the idea quickly became more useful. In 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was created. Telephone lines began appearing in towns and cities. Early users often had to speak through one part of the device and listen through another. Operators connected calls by hand. As telephone networks grew, businesses could communicate faster. Families could speak across long distances. A voice no longer had to be in the same room to be heard. Communication was changing forever. So, who invented the telephone? There is no completely simple answer. Alexander Graham Bell received the famous 1876 U.S. patent and successfully demonstrated a practical telephone with Thomas Watson. That is why his name became closely connected with the invention. But other inventors also made important contributions. Antonio Meucci had experimented with electrical voice communication earlier. Elisha Gray was developing related technology at almost the same time as Bell. And many other engineers would later improve the telephone. Invention is often like this. A new technology does not always appear because of one person and one moment. Sometimes many people work on the same problem. One discovery leads to another, and eventually the pieces come together. The telephone continued to change after Bell's time. Networks became larger. Calls traveled farther. Telephone operators were gradually replaced by automatic systems. Then came mobile phones, and eventually smartphones. Today, billions of people carry communication devices in their pockets. We can speak to someone on another continent. We can send photographs. We can make video calls. And we can communicate almost instantly. The technology is completely different from Bell's simple machine, but the basic dream remains familiar, allowing one human voice to reach another across a distance. What began with wires, experiments, and competing inventors helped create the connected world we live in today. Before we finish, let's learn 5 useful English words from today's story. Transmit. To send something from one place to another. Bell wanted to transmit the human voice through a wire. Vibration. A small, quick movement backward and forward. The telephone used vibrations from the human voice. Patent. A legal right given to an inventor for an invention. Bell received an important telephone patent in 1876. Device.
A piece of equipment made for a particular purpose. Bell and Watson experimented with different devices. Communication. The process of sharing information with other people. The telephone transformed communication around the world.
The telephone began as an idea that seemed almost impossible. How could a human voice travel through a wire? But Bell, Meucci, Gray, Watson, and others kept experimenting. Their work helped change the way people communicate. Today, we rarely think about how extraordinary it is to hear someone's voice from thousands of kilometers away. But less than 200 years ago, that idea sounded like a dream. It's time for questions. Write your answer in the comments. Which invention has changed human communication the most? Why? Thank you for joining us on this journey through the story of the telephone. See you in the next story.